Hello and welcome to episode 3 of the Gladiator podcast. Here today is myself, Joker Boney, and with me is
UFO,
as well as
Seismic Lawns,
and also
Lightning.
And we're here today to talk about Historic Anthology 4, which just recently got released on Arena.
And indeed we are. The set has just released on Arena and has brought quite a few new and interesting effects to Gladiator and the decks within.
With Historic Anthology 4, you can either craft these cards individually, or you can buy a playset of all of them. Playset in this case meaning 4 of each of these cards, which doing so will cost you either 25,000 gold or 4,000 gems. The set has 25 different cards, and we'll be talking about each of these in the context of Gladiator, and for this set specifically, we'll be talking about all of these cards since there's such a small number.
We sure are. Let's start off with the first one. Adorned Pouncer, a 2-mana 1/1 for 1 and a white with double strike. It is a creature cat, and it has Eternalize, which is an ability from Hour of Devastation that says, exile this card from your graveyard, create a token that's a copy of it, except it's a 4/4 black zombie with no mana cost in addition to its other types, and you can Eternalize only as a sorcery, and it Eternalizes for 3 white.
A lot of text on that card, but basically it reads as a decent 2-drop in a lot of our white decks that turns into late game. And I kind of like Adorned Pouncer in that sense where you have a sort of transitionary period where you want to be playing things early, and then the fact that they'll be able to do things later in the game when you have more mana, because you're almost guaranteed to have more mana in most decks of this format. It's just what I want to see. Eternalize is very good for that, because it makes your kind of smaller creatures that you're playing early come out and be much more impactful later in the game, because they're usually playing them for the effect and not the body.
Yeah, so Adored Pouncer is pretty good. Get it in your decks. And next we have Declaration in Stone. It is a 2-mana, 1 and a white sorcery that says exile target creature and all other creatures its controller controls with the same name as that creature. That player investigates for each non-token creature exiled this way. When someone investigates, they get a colorless artifact token called Clue that you can pay 2 mana and sacrifice and draw a card.
Declaration in Stone is perhaps one of the greatest white removal spells we've gotten in the past few years, and it certainly will pull its weight in this format. It's really useful in taking out must-answer threats early in the game. It doesn't exile questing beasts quite like a champ, but it does exile almost any threat pretty well, and cards like Declaration in Stone only make haste more important for other decks, since really the only big downside of Declaration of Stone is the sorcery speed aspect of it. The fact that a lot of these decks that are going to be hit by Declaration in Stone also have to then spend time and mana sacrificing a clue in order to get even a card back means that Declaration of Stone both acts as a really good tempo play and also works to completely get rid of huge, insane threats that might come even early in the game.
And notably, they're not always going to get a clue, because sometimes you do need to get rid of a token. And I've had it misread to me that Declaration in Stone can't hit tokens. It can hit tokens. It actually is better to hit tokens.
Much better to hit tokens.
Yeah, especially as it wipes out multiple tokens. In our singleton format, wouldn't hit multiple non-token creatures.
Notably, this can get rid of multiple non-token creatures in the form of copy effects, things that will clone creatures as non-token copies, and also deals with token copies really well, meaning that you can exile, in some cases, one creature that's been copied multiple times, and even if they investigate multiple times, that's still a lot of effort that they need to put into drawing more cards later in the game.
All for 2 mana, just making it a very, very impactful card in this format. As mentioned, this is one of the best white removal spells that we have. It's going into a lot of white decks, and it's going to mess your opponent up. Speaking of cards that are going to mess your opponent up, next we have Threadman Inspector, a 1-mana 1/2 that when it enters the battlefield, it investigates. As we mentioned before, investigating gives you a clue, so, has pretty good stuff going on.
Man, do I have fond memories of Threadman Inspector. Shadows of Innistrad was possibly my first set, and my first real constructed deck that I built was focused around making as many clues as possible. by getting as many investigate triggers as possible. And the core of that deck is this little card, Threadman Inspector. For 1 mana, you get a 1/2 human soldier, and those types can be relevant, but more than those relevant types is the clue. The fact that it's a 1-drop in white that then allows you to use excess mana later in the game to draw cards means that it's kind of everything that mono white is looking for in this format, and most white X creature decks as well. Being able to put cards on layaway is pretty nice and very important.
Yeah, for sure. Especially out of a 1-drop that can still fight other aggressive decks. This blocks 1/1s and 1/2s all day.
Make sure though that you have the right tokens for this. Way back when I was first building that investigate deck, was so inundated with my love of clues that I bought all the clues available in my local game store. For the next 4 years, anytime anyone wanted to get a clue token for something that they were playing in, say, a modern or commander deck, and they looked around and asked for it, the store had to let them know that some asshole bought all the tokens, and they had no more to sell them.
Language.
It's PG-13, we're allowed one.
Okay. Thankfully, Arena's all digital, so we don't have to worry about that problem for Gladiator. But
imagine if I have a game that's making too many clue tokens, you can't make any more clue tokens.
Sorry, we've loaded too many assets.
I'm just trying to play a Raging Goblin. What are you talking about?
We've loaded too many assets into another person's game, so we're giving you an asset error.
Our asset error.
This instance has too many clues. Please
get a clue and stop.
Get a clue and stop this bit. Sounds good. Next card. So this next card is a little... Let's just say that people aren't entirely sure that this card is playable, but some of us here have some ideas. It's called Triumphant Reckoning. It is a 9-mana sorcery, 6 white, white, white. Return all artifacts, enchantments, and planeswalker cards from your graveyard to the battlefield. Lightning, can you tell me about this card?
Yeah, so Triumphant Reckoning is obviously a very different card from the ones we've talked about before. And this 9-mana sorcery feels like a card that should stay in the commander format it was born in. And while this card isn't going to find a home in most decks in the format, there is one other card that has become popular that may allow it to have a place here. That card is Emergent Ultimatum. Emergent Ultimatum is a 7-mana sorcery, black, black, green, 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 blue, blue, and reads, I need to actually grab this before starting to talk, because I'm good at this. Emergent Ultimatum is a 7-mana sorcery, black, black, green, 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 blue, blue, that reads, search your library for up to 3 monocolored cards with different names and exile them. An opponent chooses one of those cards, shuffle that into your library, and then you may cast the other cards without paying their mana costs. You also exile Emergent Ultimatum. Emergent Ultimatum has become the basis for one of the combo decks in our format, which revolves around using Emergent Ultimatum to put an Omniscience into play. Previously, these decks had to create piles that did not outright... no, wording that's weird. Hang on.
While you're thinking about this, I just realized something. Not you, Lightning, but Joker.
Yo, what's up?
You said the forbidden word in the last segment.
What was the forbidden word?
QB.
Oh
no, that was me.
Oh,
Ah!
Seismic.
Oh no, that was me. Ah. Questing Beast is 2 green green for a legendary beast. It's a 4/4 with Vigilance, Death Touch, and Haste. It can't be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less. Combat damage that would be dealt by creatures you control can't be prevented, and whenever Questing Beast deals combat damage to a planeswalker, no!
You sound in fear while reading it.
Good.
I am in fear while reading it. Questing Beast is 2 green green for a legendary beast. It's a 4/4. Questing Beast is 2 green green for a legendary beast 4/4 with Vigilance, Death Touch, and Haste. It has Vigilant. Questing Beast is 2 green green for a legendary 4/4 beast with Vigilance, Death Touch, and Haste. It can't be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less. Combat damage that would be dealt by creatures your... Questing Beast is 2 green for a legendary 4/4 beast with vigilance, death touch, and haste. It can't be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less. Combat damage that would be dealt by creatures you control can't be prevented. And whenever Questing Beast deals combat damage to a player, it deals that much damage to target planeswalker that opponent controls. I'm free!
Anyway.
Triumphant Reckoning.
How you feeling, Lightning? You ready?
Yeah. Okay. Emergent Ultimatum has become the basis for one of the most popular combo decks in our format, which looks to use it to cast an Omniscience, and then win off having an Omniscience in play. And Triumphant Reckoning allows you to create a set of 3 cards that guarantees you will see Omniscience in play. And while I'm not entirely sure it's correct for these Emergent Ultimatum decks to be playing Triumphant Reckoning, the card itself is going to be very mediocre outside of specifically putting Omniscience into play. And those decks have tended to remain purely 3 colors.
Yeah, casting Emergent is hard enough already.
I mean, you don't really cast Omniscience in the Sultai Ultimatum decks, even though it's technically possible to cast that card in those decks. So it's definitely a case where you can, quote-unquote, splash white for this one card, but just never intend to pay mana for it.
I do think it's worth mentioning that beyond just allowing for a new pile, as Lightning mentioned, the bonus of this pile, by the way, for those of you trying to think it through, is that this pile doesn't have to target your opponent.
For clarity, Triumphant Reckoning works pretty well in a new concept for emergent piles, and all the emergent piles that currently exist and are played in the format will be talked about during the combo-specific episode.
Yeah, so expect that soon, where we can talk about whether or not you should be playing extra 9-mana cards in your deck, because I'm sure we all have different opinions about it.
Oh, we do.
And for the next card, we have a crab! It's 2 mana for an 0/4 crab. Its name is Iceberg Kancrix. Kancrix?
Kancrix.
We're keeping this in the episode, by the way.
It Kancrix, indeed.
Kancrix? Kancrix can... What a Kancrix can?
I can't shake the image of that crab on the art doing the can now.
And it also says, whenever another snow permanent enters the battlefield under your control, you may have target player mill 2 cards.
Target player.
Target player.
Also, if you look closely at it, it's holding another smaller crab claw. Even though it's just ice, it looks like another crab claw.
I think it's a fish in ice, isn't it?
Maybe, but it looks a little bit like a crab claw.
It's holding a surprisingly square block of ice. That block of ice is too square.
You could convince people that that's like a little grabber right there, that little triangle in its art.
I mean, you can also try and convince people that this thing has an eye, but I'm not sure I'd agree with you.
It absolutely has an eye.
That is definitely an eye. What are you talking
That is
about?
100% an eye.
No, you see guns, bullet hole.
What plane does Iceberg Kancrix come from that has guns?
I don't know, but I want to be on it.
I guess they do say that the eye is the hole into the soul. Seismic, tell us about this card.
So Iceberg Kancrix is really interesting. Notably, it's the first crab that can mill its controller, which is...
On Arena.
On Arena, which is kind of baffling to say, considering that most crabs on Arena are able to mill the opponent, but not the controller of the Kancrix. Notably, I don't think this goes into what people might consider a dedicated snow deck, mainly because I don't think that deck truly has the density to be viable right now. Instead, I think it's a great way to fill up your graveyard in decks with only 1 or 2 colors in them, because you can turn all of your basics, as long as they're snow-covered lands, into milling yourself for 2 cards, which in decks like Reanimator that try to put creatures from the graveyard onto the battlefield and swing in with absurdly overcosted creatures, Iceberg Kancrix not only does the job, but does it incredibly well. Milling 2 cards every turn for 2 mana is surprisingly hard to come by, and Iceberg Kancrix is probably the closest we have to that, and it does that job specifically pretty well.
Yeah, also being an 0/4 is actually quite nice.
Yeah, this blocks a ton of creatures and also pretty much only dies to a handful of damage-based removal spells.
Yeah, the more premium ones, which when using them on your 2-drop, you're kind of happy about that.
Notably, using it on a 2-drop that doesn't effectively attack, and so is also already less likely to have removal pointed at it.
This crab will block all of the creatures.
Well, except for Questing Beast.
You said it.
I already said the text.
You said it.
I'm not saying it again. You can't make me. You're not my real dad.
And neither is this next card your real father.
Is that what we're going with that?
Yes.
We're
Okay.
keeping it.
Very well.
Okay. All right.
Starting strong with this
Real thing first. All we know for sure is that Seismic Father is not Merit Wages Slumber, which is a 2-mana enchantment, legendary snow, and it says, whenever it or another snow permanent enters the battlefield under your control, scry 1. At the beginning of your upkeep, if you control 10 or more snow permanents, sacrifice Merit Wages Slumber. If you do, create Merit Wage, a legendary 2020 black avatar creature token with flying and indestructible. And I'm hijacking this because my fellow podcast members have mentioned that they don't think this card is good enough, and let me tell you why it is good enough. And it isn't good enough because it's a snow payoff. I just want to scry off of my basic lands. I want to put this in a Simic deck. I just want to use my lands to be able to scry. I want to turn every snow basic in my deck into a scry, turn them all into temples, just get amazing value off of this. And then when I have it in play with an effect that allows me to draw cards off of me playing lands, I get to scry and then draw a card off of it. And then heck, if the game goes long enough, who knows? Maybe I'll get to attack them with the giant flying 2020 indestructible. But I probably already won because I was able to see more of my deck thanks to this card.
I was the only person, I think, that actually didn't like this card. And it wasn't even that I didn't like the card in general. I didn't like it in the deck that Seismic gave me. I immediately cut it and all the other snow synergies. Seismic, why don't you talk about why those are good in your deck?
So, Merit Wages Slumber both acts as that way to scry off of each of your snow permanents. It also acts as another reason to run snow basics, which for me is mainly more of an excuse to play other cards that care about snow permanents than per se a reason to play Merit Wages Slumber. The real power of the deck, though, comes from the fact that a lot of the decks that can utilize Merit Wages Slumber to their peak efficiency are lands decks. And those decks will oftentimes, well, not oftentimes, but way more often than they should be, are getting 10 or more lands into play. And a good portion of the time, most of those lands, if not all of them, are snow basics, which means you get a free 2020 that usually will kill the opponent. And I've actually managed to make this card give me a 2020 already in just a few days of testing.
Yeah, sure. But the deck that you're playing this in and you gave me is running less than 50% snowlands.
I mean, when you have like 13 or 14 ways to find basics in your deck, I'm effectively running like around 30 to 40 ways to grab snow basics.
Yeah, sure, but you've only got 15 snowlands in the deck in the first place.
Okay, yeah, this doesn't need to go as deep as you're taking it.
Very well.
Fight.
This segment has gone much deeper than Merit Wage ever went, but it's not going to go as deep as this next card.
Ooh.
What, 2 cards?
I mean,
You're not wrong.
I'd like to review the card, please.
This next card being Think Twice, which is 2 mana for an instant that says draw a card. And then Flashback for 2 in the blue. Flashback being that you can cast this from your graveyard at any time you could normally cast it by exiling it from your graveyard when it resolves. UFO. Maybe this one's a bit more your speed.
Yeah, so this is a 2-mana cantrip, and it is kind of in the same league in my eyes with a lot of the other 2-mana cantrips available to us in Gladiator. It lacks some of the initial dig that, say, an Anticipate or a Omen of the Sea or a Deliberate does, where each of those 3 cards will effectively see about 3 cards from your deck from that first cast. Think Twice being just draw a card full stop means that you're much less in control over what you draw, but you get to draw twice as many things over the course of a game with this card. What this benefits the card for is in like a control matchup, you're able to use this to gain card advantage as opposed to just cycling it. And if you're looking to be a little slower as a deck and you're facing slower decks in the format, this will often be potentially better as your 2-mana cantrip. But you do kind of need to be aware that the other 2-mana cantrips that we have available to us, read, anticipate, and deliberate, will often be better early game, whereas this is much better and more scalable to the late game. Card's good. It's not a one-for-one replacement. It's definitely another thing to consider when including blue cantrips in your deck.
It's definitely an interesting one, just because, especially in these sort of control matchups, you can sometimes see people countering other people's draw spells, and this can sort of help you get around it because you get to cast it twice.
Yeah.
It finds a surprisingly interesting middle ground between our current 2-mana to draw a card with a bit of upside and our 4-mana draw 2 cards with a little bit of upside as well. And so this has that upside of being able to switch between those two modes at depending on what game you're in.
Yeah, definitely. It also has 2 casts on it, which can matter for a few things in the format.
Speaking of casting things a lot and efficiently, let's go to Ahmed Eternal, a 3-mana 5/5 zombie crocodile demon. Alright, card's done, we're good? We're good? Right, no, there's more text. Has afflict 3, which means whenever it's blocked, the controller of that creature that blocked it loses 3 life. And then it also has, whenever an opponent casts a spell, put a -1/-1 counter on Ahmed Eternal. Whenever Ahmed Eternal deals combat damage to a player, remove all -1/-1 counters from it. Seismic, tell me a bit about this card.
Ahmed Eternal works really well in mono-black aggressive decks as a big, undercosted creature with a downside that tends not to matter as much as it should. In this case, Ahmed Eternal theoretically dies to an opponent playing a bunch of spells in a row. However, even when your opponent casts 2 or 3 spells in a turn, it's still a 2/2 that, or a 3/3 that when it is blocked will hit the opponent for 3. And if it isn't blocked, it goes right back to being a 5/5. Ahmed Eternal tends to be really powerful and puts your opponent into a very interesting situation where they are punished if they block it and punished arguably more if they don't block it. And Ahmed Eternal tends to stay around a 3/3 most of the time, which is more than fine when your opponent will still take 3 from blocking this Ahmed Eternal. It pretty much makes it so you can't chump block it. Additionally, it has the best type line in the set and potentially the best type line on Arena of Zombie Crocodile Demon.
And it is worth mentioning with this card that while it can look sort of bad, and people have definitely, as Seismic mentioned, sure, sometimes they're going to cast a bunch of spells and it'll just die, but it's very important with cards like this to not look at it just in its worst case, as it has a lot of stuff going on that's good for it. And also to take into realization that if someone's using, say, a burn spell against this, most of the burn spells that'll kill it are things that would kill other things that you play on this curve. So, it's still very good, and it's just, it's another beater that's going to kill your opponent real fast. Going from one beater to another, let's talk about Death Shadow, which is a 1-mana 13/13 creature type avatar. Death Shadow gets -X/-X, where X is your life total. Lightning, tell me a bit about this card.
So Death Shadow is known for being very popular in Modern over the past couple years, and I believe made a showing even in Legacy. But while it has found a home in 60-card formats, it's going to be a bit more niche here, because you're not going to be as able to control your life total, and even when you do, you're not always going to see this card because it's 1 in 100. That being said, it does seem to have found a place in a couple archetypes. Joker, I know you have talked to a lot of the blue-black tempo pilots about including Death Shadow.
Yes, the grand total of 2 of us, myself being one of them. But this is a card that, obviously, when it came out, a lot of people were talking about, well, where could this card see play? Because, as Lightning mentioned, it's definitely a household name in other formats, so people were like, can I build a Death Shadow deck here in Gladiator? And while that's still not true, I've started being able to mess around with it in Blueback Tempo, where you normally cast this about turn 4 or 5, where if you're in an aggressive matchup, this gets to be about a 4/4 or 5/5 usually, and then you get to hold the rest of your mana up, which means that you're able to counter their spells or kill their things while holding this body. That's very good and very relevant. And especially with that deck, you're able to cycle some of the cards in your hand away, get rid of cards that don't matter in certain matchups. So when you're against a much more controlling deck or a much grindier mid-range deck, you're able to get this out of the way because you're never going to be at a point where you're in a healthy life total to play this. But it's been a very, very impressive card versus aggressive decks. Just making a stone wall that will end the game, especially when you don't see your lifelinkers or any of your other buffers against the aggressive decks. It's a very important tool in winning those games.
It certainly puts aggressive decks into a point where they can't really put you to close to dead but not quite dead, since if they do, you're just going to have an insanely big creature that can just immediately crack back and kill them.
I did get to hit someone with a 12/12 Death Shadow in Gladiator already. It felt good. I was at 1 and I was winning the game in a blue-black tempo deck, which it was also awkward because I had some spells that required me to pay life in my hand, but we won that game. We made it work.
That's the price of success.
When you have a 12/12, you'll live with it.
Powerful plays. And speaking of powerful plays, let's talk about the powerful card, as I'm sure my co-host will agree when they read it. Faith of the Devoted, a 3-mana enchantment for 2 and a black that says whenever you cycle or discard a card, you may pay 1. If you do, each opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life.
Oh boy, time for cycling talk again.
So, UFO, I know that you have had a lot of experience with cycling.
Don't give any context.
Yeah,
just throw it to me.
We don't want context here.
You want context? So, UFO, what can you tell me about this card?
So, I've got a bit of a bias against the cycling deck. I'll just make that clear. I think that the cycling sort of aspect of it was not what I didn't like. And this kind of shores up what I was wanting to see when I built Jeskai cycling combo all those months ago.
Sounds like a perfect deck with no problems.
Yes, a perfect deck with no problems. None whatsoever. It didn't nearly make me rage quit from the entire format. You can't convince me otherwise.
Perfect deck.
But this idea of having some sort of benefit when you cycle or discard your own cards is very interesting to see, honestly, in black right now, because it doesn't exist as part of Arena's color identity for black. Like, you have really no self-discard in black. There's nothing that you will discard cards for effect. Everything is other colors. And that sort of implies something that I'm excited for, is that those kind of effects are becoming a little bit more because we're getting Shadows or Innistrad soon. So I'm not too excited for this card right now, because Mono Black is not actually discarding many cards from their own hand very often. And this card wants you to do that. I think going forward, once, like, say, Madness becomes a thing we're getting, because it will be a thing we're getting once the Shadows block comes to Arena, Faith of the Devoted may actually find its way into some very interesting decks.
I do want to mention that I do think it has a little bit of place in decks right now. To go back on Dimir for a moment, instead of Tempo going to Control, this is kind of one of those effects that kind of deck would want. I'm not saying for 100% it should get into that deck, but it's one of those things where repeatable ways to gain life and just a win con that you can drop whenever and just be like, alright. It's just a very unique effect. As you mentioned, it's a very unique effect, and it has power. It can do powerful things.
Mm-hmm.
It just depends on if people put faith in it being able to do so. As long as you have devotion to the idea of playing maybe a more black-based control deck, maybe a Rakdos control deck, I think that there's very interesting things that can be done with this. It just depends on what people do. And speaking about cards that are very interesting, but probably not too great, Tormentous Scarabs. It's a 4-mana black enchantment or a curse. Enchant player. At the beginning of enchanted player's upkeep, that player loses 3 life unless they sacrifice a non-land permanent or discard a card. Seismic, what do you think about this curse?
I think, frankly, that if I were to pick up this card and to play it immediately, I would more often than not be under Torment than putting my opponent under Torment. But I do think this has some amount of application in some of the more weird decks in our format. The fact that this card not only benefits playing the long game, but the incredibly long game, and does it on an enchantment, at the very least makes me think about one deck, and that deck is Prison. A deck all about playing enchantments that make it harder for your opponent to play Magic. And this doesn't necessarily seem like it'd be the best fit in that deck, just because it's 4 mana, doesn't immediately impact the game, and will have a kind of middling effect throughout the game. I do like at least the idea of it in that deck, just because it can kill the opponent.
Yeah, I've been trying it out in Mardu Prison recently. I've been moving away from black and prison decks currently, just because of the effects that we have, but it's definitely one of the pushes towards it. This and some other cards that we've gotten recently that have very similar effects. Just being able to choke our opponent's resources. It definitely gives another layer to the deck, if nothing else.
My mind immediately went to Abzan Enchantress when I saw this card. Already running Heliod's Pilgrim. This is the theoretical deck, by the way. Running Heliod's Pilgrim to find Overwhelming Splendor already, and now you have a much less expensive aura to get from your Heliod's Pilgrim.
Yeah, it definitely has some ways to pull weight, and definitely not a type of deck that we see around often, but if it did see more play, it would be very interesting to see what it could do.
This is the one card that I am not excited to play myself, but am the most excited to see other people play it and then ask questions based on it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yep. Some of the cards you look and you're like, man, I know some people who are going to brew with this card so much, and I want to see what they've come up with, right? Just what goes on inside their heads.
And for this creature, I'm curious what's going inside their head when they bring out this Flameblade, because we're talking about a Flameblade Adept. Another 1 mana 1/2. This one is a Jackal Warrior, and it has Menace. And it says, whenever you cycle or discard a card, Flameblade Adept gets +1/+0 until end of turn. Lightning, can you talk to me a little bit about this card?
Flameblade Adapt is maybe not a card we can utilize to its full potential, like it's done in 60 card formats, but the card is also just a 1/2 with Menace for 1. And having that bit of extra evasion, and then the potential to maybe add a point of power or two. I don't know that this goes into, say, stock mono red right now, but I think this card has potential to see homes. And I know that the warrior type is one that a couple people here have been taking notice of recently. I'm not sure whether this card goes in warriors, but it seems alright as a 1-drop.
Oh, it 100% goes into warriors. Just as you mentioned, just another 1-drop with the warrior subtype that has a good body, good text on it. And if you slap a piece of equipment on this or have a lord effect in play, it's just gonna kill your opponent. It has Menace, which means that it's already hard to block, which can be very awkward, especially against more controlling strategies, which are going to play a wall or something to try and clog up the board. And it's going to need to find another wall very quickly, otherwise you're just going to be punching past it no matter what.
Notably, is a low-cost non-human warrior, and warriors is at its core a Winota deck, which means that having an evasive non-human warrior to trigger Winota in the mid to late game is kind of the baseline that your early drops need to be. You're kind of avoiding early humans if you can afford it.
Additionally, there's some surprising ways that you might be able to trigger this card in warriors.
Oh yeah, we definitely want to get like a Neheb.
Or Seasoned Hallowblade.
Oh, right.
Which is 1 and a white for a 3/1 human warrior, and it says discard a card to tap Seasoned Hallowblade and it gains indestructible.
Yeah, because white got all the free discard outlets on Arena for some reason.
Hey, we take those. We take those.
It's 2021. The text boxes are made up and the colors don't matter.
Yeah, apparently free discord is an Azorius thing now.
Don't worry about it, it's fine. But yeah, it's just, if you get to trigger this once in a game, and maybe some games you get to do it twice, you got to swing in with a 1 mana 2/2, which is something that we just don't have a lot of in this format, especially in mono red. So, we take those.
Moreover, a 1-mana 2/2 with Menace, which is way stronger than just a 1-mana 2/2.
Yeah, just it's gonna get in, it's gonna cause havoc, and it might win you the game. Now talking about other 1-mana warriors, let's go to Goblin Gavaliere. It is a 1-mana 1/1, not a 1/2, unfortunate. But instead of Menace, it has Trample, and it also has a very strange line of text on it. Goblin Gavaliere gets +2/+0 for each equipment attached to it. Look at the mouth on that goblin. Like,
It's terrifying.
Higo Bois.
that's just, that mouth is...
More importantly, look at the arms and just the size of them.
Like, there's probably some foreshortening in this image, but
Not enough to justify those arms in that way.
exactly. Especially considering how big the mallet is, and it's definitely behind them.
Ugh.
So you're gonna get bonked. And honestly, this is kind of what equipment sort of tribal has been looking for. Some reason to be playing all these low equip cost, low sort of stat benefit equipment, like say Short Sword, a 1-mana equipment that equips for 1 and gives +1/+1. It is completely vanilla, and so few creatures have cared about equipment being on them that it's not usually in lists that even care about equipment excessively, because we have a decent range of ones that are just a little bit better and a little bit more expensive, but more impactful. I think getting more Goblin Gavaliere effects into Arena will bring equipment-based aggro a little bit more lower to the ground when it comes to the equipment they are wanting to play, and may start seeing those short swords again.
Yeah, it's not an exciting card, I'm going to be honest with you. Sorry, Mink. The goblin in the set, not very exciting, but
I mean, it's exciting for me because they called it.
fair enough.
I mean, it probably goes into Goblin Tribal just by nature of being a cheap goblin.
Probably. But I don't think that this card gets in if your list has a tiny bit of equipment. Like, I'm not running for my mono red deck because I'm already playing some absurd equipment in red colors. I'm sure you can think of one very particular 6-mana card that is an equipment.
It's never 6 mana, let's be honest.
It's like 5 mana. It's actually almost always 5 mana at most.
The 2-mana equipment. I'm sure you can think of some equipment that you'd put in your mono red deck, but that does not mean that you put this card into your deck. You definitely want to be more all-in on the sort of equipment-based strategy if you're going to be playing this card, but otherwise, maybe you leave this one on the shelf when you're looking at cards to put in your deck. We have a lot of powerful ones already for red decks, so this doesn't need to get in there unless you're already going to be playing a lot of equipment.
I think you notably probably have to be playing every good colorless equipment, and then probably a couple that aren't good as well.
This one gets Crystal Slipper off the shelf.
I think if you're not going as deep as Prying Blade, you're not going as deep as Goblin Gavaliere.
I think you leave that one on the shelf.
I don't know, Prying Blade's actually surprisingly good.
That one equips for 2, though.
Yeah, I'd rather be on Goldvein Pick, to be honest.
Well, I'm saying you're already on Goldvein Pick, but you're going as deep as Prying Blade.
Yeah, you have to go real deep in order to want Gavaliere.
Very, very quick note for some of the cards we talked about. Prying Blade is a 1-mana equipment that has 2 to equip. It gives is it +1/+1 or +2?
+1/+0, and whenever it hits, you get a treasure.
And then to talk about Crystal Slipper, because this is one that you guys may not know. This is an uncommon equipment from Eldraine. It is 1 in a red, equipped for 1, and it gives creature +1/+0 and haste. This is a card that we don't see as much, but could definitely get in with more Gavaliere effects, just as a very cheap way to give haste. Although to talk about other cards you probably shouldn't play in this format, Harmless Offering. 3 mana, 2 in a red, for a sorcery that says, target opponent gains control of target permanent you control. Seismic, tell me what jank stuff people want to do with it in this format.
So, Joker Brony, you kind of summed it up with you shouldn't be playing this. However, there are some surprisingly dumb things you can do with it. I think the most dumb card that you can use with this is called Demonic Pact. It's 2 black for an enchantment, and says, at the beginning of your upkeep, choose one that hasn't been chosen. Demonic Pact deals 4 damage to any target and you gain 4 life. Target opponent discards 2 cards, draw 2 cards, or you lose the game. What you're trying to do with this card is to use the first 3 modes to give yourself a bunch of advantages, and then use Harmless Offering to give Demonic Pact to your opponent so that they have to lose the game on their upkeep.
Alright, and so we convince ourselves to play this card in our deck because we can also use this when we have enchantment-based removal to give them control of the enchantment-based removal so they can't use removal that says destroy target non-land permanent that your opponent controls.
I mean, sure. I'm actually more interested in playing this in a much more ridiculous sort of strategy.
Okay.
And this is called a yes deck. A yes deck is actually a term that comes from other card games, mostly digital, where you control the board until you combo off and give your opponent the means to win, and they need to figure out how to do it.
So you want to make other people do your puzzles for you.
Oh, yes.
So, how are we saying yes to the dress with this card?
Honestly, I don't know yet, but I've got some ideas going through my head. Potentially giving someone a happily ever after and trying to make them figure out how to win with that one. That's like the first thing that comes to mind.
And now on to another bridesmaid. Lissalana Huntmaster is a 4-mana 3/3 for 2 green. It is an elf warrior that says whenever you cast an elf spell, you may create a 1/1 green elf warrior creature token. Lightning, can you tell me a little bit about this card and whether or not we should be seeing it?
So this card is interesting in that it allows you to take a strategy, elves, that already plans to go wide and go even wider with it. And while I know we have some form of an elf ball hoof deck, I don't know that it necessarily goes into that, because a lot of the elf ball lists are looking to turn a lot of cheap mana producing creatures, which are usually elves, into snowballing into a lot of big top end threats. And Lissalana Huntmaster gives you more added value on your cheap creatures, but it's also not that hard of a hitter at 4. But I do think that there is potential given this card, one other card we're going to talk about later, and in some of the more recent elves in Kaldheim, to build some version of a black-green mid-range go-wide elves, where this ends up shining a lot more.
That black-green mid-range probably leans closer to aggro, since it turns out a lot of the recently printed elves do have a lot of aggro potential. You have cards like Dwinnen's Elite, which is 1 and a green for a 2/2 elf warrior that when enters the battlefield, if you control another elf, you get another 1/1 green elf warrior. And there's a lot of cards like Dwinnen's Elite in this format that are surprisingly cheap, might be a little undercosted as long as you're playing more elves, and also can just hit your opponent instead of needing to ramp into huge threats to do so. I think that there's definitely ground for a elf deck that tries to just play elves that can attack rather than play elves that just add mana. And I think if that happens, Lissalana Huntmaster is fairly high up on the list of cards that you want, although it does do a fairly poor interpretation of another green elf that makes 1/1 elf warriors in Elvish Warmaster, which is 1 and a green for a 2/2 elf warrior that says whenever another elf enters the battlefield under your control, you create a 1/1 green elf warrior token, and that ability only triggers once. You can also pay 7 mana to give all of your elves +2/+2 and Death Touch until end of turn. And so I think probably both of these cards get into that deck. I think that Lissalana Huntmaster, if the deck gets better and better, might end up not seeing the cut eventually, but I don't think we're there yet.
Sounds like this card and that elf deck will demolish our opponent. And as so will this card, Sawtuffs Demolisher, a 6-mana 6/6 with trample. That's a pretty good rate. It has Mutate for 3 and a green. Mutate is you can cast the spell for its mutate cost, and it mutates onto a non-human creature, which means that you can either put it on top or below the creature, and it usually gets you an additional effect, and whichever creature is on top, you follow the stats, the mana cost, the creature types, the name for that, and then you have all the text boxes of all the cards that are mutated in the mutate pile. And then when this creature mutates, destroy target non-creature permanent. Its controller creates a 3/3 green beast creature token. UFO, how about you tell me about this Colossal Dreadmaw that has mutate?
So, I heard you like Colossal Dreadmaw.
Yes.
What if I offered you Colossal Dreadmaw plus utility?
Alright.
Because that's what this is. 6/6 trample for 6 is honestly not a terrible rate in our format. And the ability to mutate for a little bit less mana to still get that same stat line and potentially even more stats on your side if you got something that's useless is pretty impressive in all consideration.
If your opponent just harmless acted you a demonic pact, turn it into a 3/3, make your opponent cry.
Or just your own demonic pact in a Golgari deck.
Also works.
Please don't encourage people to play Demonic Pact.
Actually, no, encourage people to play Demonic Pact. I'll beat them with it.
Yeah.
This sounds like value.
Wait, you're gonna beat them with a piece of paper?
Death by 1,000 paper cuts. This is the motto of prison.
But Demonic Pact, you can't do death by 1,000 cuts with Demonic Pact.
You have to do death by, like, max 3 cuts. The 4th cut kills you.
Not if we keep on bouncing it and returning it to play. We can make 1,000 cuts happen.
Just like we're bouncing topics?
Yeah. Anyway, Sawtuffs Demolisher, at its base, will just be a 6-mana 6/6. And that's not the best, but it's also not the worst. Then you can mutate it over some random 1/1 ramp creature, kill one of your lands, and now you've spent 4 mana for 9 power. And in these sort of stompy decks, that's kind of what you want to be doing, because you can do that as early as turn 3.
Even better, UFO, you can mutate this onto a Gem Raiser.
That is true. Gem Raiser is very popular and should be played in most decks playing green. I will never get off this high horse. Play more Gem Raiser.
Gem Raiser, for those who don't know, is 3 and a green for a 4/4 beast with reach and trample, has mutate for 1 and double green, and says, when this creature mutates, destroy target artifact or enchantment an opponent controls.
I will also mention that, speaking of ramp creatures that you could possibly put this on, there's a rather popular Golden Goose.
Mm-hmm.
And if you get this on that, then you have a 6/6 trampler with flying.
It also lets you kill the food that you made
Oh,
to make a 3/3 instead of gaining 3 life.
I didn't even think about that part.
Honestly, the more you talk about it, the more I'm up on playing this card in most decks.
It's like Oko, but if Oko was a 6 mana 6/6.
Hey, we also have we have that. We have a 6 mana Oko.
But it's not a 6/6 as well.
It can be a 6/6 if it copies your Colossal Dreadmaw.
Save me.
Alright. But yeah, honestly, this card was a bit of a weird card looking into it. I still don't think it gets into the more aggressive or stompier builds of green, but I could absolutely see this getting into the mid-range decks just because you're happy to play this on curve in those decks, and in the games where you get to mutate it, sometimes it says, hey, I went from no power to 9 power. Or even just like a sliding scale of however much you're upgrading the creature that you mutate onto this.
Yeah, the fact that it's 6/6 of stats means that it's a very significant upgrade to most creatures you can be mutating over in a deck.
Yeah, usually I'd say that 6 mana 6/6 is a little bit overcrowded of a slot right now for a lot of green ramp or stompy decks. But the fact is that it's usually not 6 mana, it's usually 4.
Yep, card's good. Play it.
Speaking of cards with big butts, we've got Spider Spawning, a 5 mana sorcery that says create a 1/2 green spider creature token with reach for each creature card in your graveyard, and it can be flashed back for 7, one of the mana being a black. Seismic, tell me if this card is as busted as everyone says it is in its draft format.
I mean, to answer your question, not quite. But more importantly, I don't think spider spawning is as much a big butt as it is a bunch of moderately sized butts.
We've got moderate butts and we cannot No.
But in terms of power, spider spawning is not nearly as good in this format as it was, say, in Innistrad Draft. However, I think it still might be playable in certain decks, especially decks that just happen to have a large graveyard, which is definitely becoming more and more possible in...
Persistent Pain?
Persistent Pain is a deck.
I mean, under technical definitions, yeah, I guess.
Is that deck ever going to be green-black?
Well, it doesn't need to be green at all.
You're right.
I mean, legitimately, Seismic, and we're not putting this in the episode because it's way too much of a tangent. I do think that the best build of Persistent Pain is actually like a value Sultai, like Sultai GPG deck.
You're probably right, honestly. Honestly, this can get into the episode. You're probably right, and I think that there's enough potential for a deck that just its only goal is to fill up its graveyard with a bunch of stuff that ultimately doesn't matter, that spider spawning is worth it. And it's a card that I generally didn't think of much. However, if your deck is pretty much entirely focused on just filling up the graveyard, not necessarily Reanimator or filling it up with specific cards, Spider Spawning might be a good card for a deck that doesn't want to do necessarily graveyard shenanigans, but absolutely just wants to fill up its graveyard to the brim.
Mm-hmm. I think a lot of people will be having a lot of fun with this card. I'm going to be honest in saying I don't think it's costed in the right number to be competitively viable in, say, the tournament scene, but that doesn't always matter.
I mean, especially if you're playing decks like Persistent Pain.
As a side note, while we're talking about it in this sort of light, I do think that there might be some sort of angle to talk about a grindier Golgari mid-range-ish control deck. Some might call it the Rock, where it's not the most impressive card, obviously. You know, it's 5 mana for the effect, but there's something to be said about what this card can do in games, and the fact that if this hits your graveyard otherwise, you just get another card in hand to use when you need it.
This card is surprisingly versatile, and it's kind of unique in Arena right now. It's not exactly unique. There's a decent amount of cards that care about the number of creatures in your graveyard, but Spider Spawning is, I think, the best way to turn that into a gradual win in the format. And that is not nothing, but I don't think it's quite enough to make a full deck based around that right now.
It's tangentially good, not a build around.
Correct.
Speaking about cards that you shouldn't build around, Hazma, Guardian of Arashin.
Hamza.
Ham?
Or Hamza.
Ham? Ham? Big Ham.
The M comes before the Z.
I said Hamza.
You said Hazma.
Hazmat? Ham.
Hamza.
Big Ham. Yeah. Big Ham. 6 mana 5/5. Legendary Ham. Ham Warrior. This Ham costs 1 less to cast. This ham costs 1 less to cast for each ham you control with a +1/+1 counter on it. Hams you cast cost 1 less to cast for each ham you control with a +1/+1 counter on it. So this ham's gonna cost about 4 mana for 5/5 most of the time, which is very relevant. Blightning, can you tell us a little bit more about this ham?
I think if we're going to do that bit, we at least have to retake it, because there's...
No, that bit's perfect.
You see, here's what you do. If it doesn't work, you just put in auto-generated voice over top of what Joker's saying.
Auto-generated ham. I can do a fresh take actually reading the card if in editing you think that the ham version is not usable.
That's probably good.
Yeah, for sure. Hamza, Guardian of Arashin, is a 6 mana 5/5 legendary creature elephant warrior. This creature costs 1 less to cast for each creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it. And then it also says, creature spells you cast cost 1 less to cast for each creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it. Hamza is an interesting card, to say the least. I'm not entirely sure where it will see play, other than the Selesnya mid-range decks that we sort of see already. Not even the Selesnya counters decks, although it's going to be even better there, but just the cards that deck is already playing. Hamza's normally going to be 4, if not 3 mana, and I already had a game the other day where I cast this on turn 5 for 3 mana, and then was able to play a 4-drop after it because of the cost reduction that it put on it. You know, that's ridiculous. That's the sort of tool that allows those decks to just spiral out of control. And again, I think it's very important to talk about this card not as a build around, but as just, this card is a big body. And it is likely always going to be at least a 5 mana 5/5 that reduces the cost of creatures by 1. And people have been playing cards like Nylea, which, just important for this note, is a god that makes your creatures cost 1 less. And while this doesn't have some of the other utility that card has, it still gets to do that and be a giant 5/5 creature. And I just think it's very important to, to talk about this card. It's going to be a card that people are going to overlook because they think it's some sort of counters build around, when I think if you're just playing the good creatures that those colors have access to, and maybe switching out 1 or 2 cards for equally powerful cards that just use counters instead of just being a creature, this card can be insane.
So, creature type warrior?
Yes. I'm not entirely sure if it's amazing in Warriors yet, but it's something that I want to try, especially with some of the lords that we have access to that put counters on the creature instead.
Yeah, Bortle Outrider being one.
Metallic Mimic being the other. Importantly, just so that we don't spend a lot of time talking about cards not in this set, both of them are cards that'll allow when we cast a creature, assuming we meet the condition, the creatures will come in with counters, and as such, that makes cards like Hamza even better. Like, I don't think trying to look at this card and being like, I can cast all my spells for free is how you should realistically rate this card, but just being able to say, because I played this card on turn 4 or 5, I will be able to develop 2 5-drops on turn 6. And that's a way to win a game, especially versus more controlling decks. As long as you can stick some of the more resilient creatures with counters, this means that you get to start double spelling way sooner, which can be a death sentence for those decks.
There's also just consistent decks right now that want to, in some cases, devote their entire game plan to putting counters on most of their creatures that already are in the colors to play this card. And so I think this card will definitely have a home somewhere, and if not in multiple different places.
Yeah, and now to talk about a card that brings things from multiple different places, even if it won't show up anywhere. Collective Conjuring is a 4-mana spell that costs 2, a blue and a red. Sorcery that says exile the top 6 cards of your library. You may cast up to 2 sorcery spells with mana value 3 or less from among them without paying their mana cost. Put the exiled cards not cast this way on the bottom of your library in a random order. So yeah, Blightning, tell me Tell me about this. Sorry, this card is just making me very depressed.
I feel that as well. This card is Collected Company is a card that is also in our format, and while it's not amazing here, it has homes where it's reasonable, and this card is just so much worse. I really wish this hit instants as well as sorceries, because we do not have the density of specifically sorcery cards that you want to be playing to reliably hit 2 spells, or even reliably hit 1 spell off of this. Like a lot of the blue-red spells decks that I've built that play like around 40 instants and sorceries tend to be skewed very heavily towards instants, and this doesn't cast them, which is probably for the best. That card would be very good, but it makes me a little sad that we don't get that.
So, questions. I've got some questions here. 1. If it was still sorcery and did say instant and sorcery, would it be playable?
Yes.
Yeah.
Secondly, is there ever been a format since this card was released 2 years ago where this card was playable?
Probably not. I don't think so.
It was playable for a very small amount of time in Modern. They were playing Temur Ponza when Oko was still legal in Modern. They would play this so that they could hit 2 pillages.
So the only thing that could actually make this thing playable is Oko.
I've seen it a little in like decks trying to cast Restore Balance, but it's not good enough anywhere. There are better ways to do that too.
So trying to cheat things that can't normally be cast. Okay, that's understandable.
Even more notably in this format, cards like Collected Company and Collected Conjuring are even harder to make work, not because of needing a density of different named cards that fulfill these purposes, but rather just because with 100 cards and with the way that mana bases and the general diversity of decks are, it's harder to find 2 different cards that both fit the criteria of those cards in the top 6. Even in decks that in this format should be built specifically to consistently get 4 to 6 mana off of these cards, They typically will hit mostly lands and a couple of cards that don't work for the collected spell, and then maybe one or two spells that actually fit.
The other issue being that oftentimes it's not usually worth it for 2 random CMC 3 or less things, either creatures or sorceries from your deck, as compared to just paying 4 mana for something that is efficient. We've got so many, like the 4 mana slot in almost every deck in this format is so competitive that something that might do nothing just often isn't worth it.
Yeah. It's painful for me as well because I think it's suffice to say that I'm probably the most versed Storm pilot in this format, Thousand Year Storm that being. And I was looking at so many different ways to try and slot this into that deck, and it just isn't there. There isn't enough effects that you care about at 3 mana or less, even with one of the main combos in that deck requiring 1 to 2 3 mana sorcery cards. It's still not good enough. One day I'll make this card work in something, but today is not that day, and it won't be for a while.
This is definitely a card that I wish people could make work, but I am a firm believer that it is difficult, if not arguably impossible, to make this card work well in Gladiator. At least not how the format looks right now.
Yeah, so Collected Conjuring isn't good enough right now. But you know what is good enough for this format right now? Abomination of Llanowar. A 1 black-green legendary creature elf horror. There's so many things going on.
I'm not counting the arms on this one.
That's fair.
It's too dark for me to count the heads at the very least.
Don't think about how many legs it has. That's all that I ask.
I think there's only 2 in shot.
Instead, we should think about the card itself.
I see
should.
17 arms.
Because it has
Why? We were gonna get away from it.
because it has vigilance and menace. The Abomination of Llanowar's power and toughness are equal to the number of elves you control, plus the number of elves cards in your graveyard. Seismic, you like elves?
I do like elves. Sorry, you caught me while I was trying to count arms.
Well, can I count on you to talk about this card then?
Abomination of Llanowar is a really interesting card because typically for this format, we don't care much about what elves are in the graveyard. However, we do have a few things that might care about elves in the graveyard. We have a couple of ways to bring elves out of the graveyard right now, as well as elves in Kaldheim generally had a slight mill theme where you might mill 1 to 3 cards relating to them. And Abomination of Llanowar works pretty well in regards to that. The text I care about is just that its power and toughness are equal to the number of elves you control, because any variation of elves will get a lot of elves onto the battlefield at some points. And when that happens, Abomination of Llanowar is probably the best threat that you can have, because it's not just a threat, it's also a blocker against aggressive decks. It hits your opponent for a ton of damage, and it's hard to block because it has menace. When I'm playing black-green traditional hoof, and I'm shoving out, a pile of 20 elves in a turn, which is not that unreasonable, swinging in with a creature that can actually do some damage is a real nice way to win the game that doesn't require hoof inherently. It's also a much easier way to detail hoof math, because if I can say, oh, I just need to give this Abomination of Llanowar trample and I win, that's a lot easier to think about than it is to think, okay, so I have these 6 creatures, most of them are 1 power, multiply each of that by 6 and go into a bunch of more math. I'd much rather be able to say, this has trample now and I'll win. Additionally, this card just acts as a elf that works well against board wipes, and that's potentially the biggest problem that elves tends to run into, is that board wipes kind of stop the deck in its tracks.
So they wrath our board. Let's say we had like 5 elves in play, then we get to play this. It's a 6/6. That seems pretty good.
It is really good, and it is both the best way to capitalize on a big board and also one of the best ways to capitalize on a board that's just been wrathed. And a lot of times when control decks use wraths, they're banking on that time to rebuild their hand rather than to snuff out any chances of the opponent to rebuild again. Abomination of Llanowar is the kind of card that is one cheap card, and after a board wipe will oftentimes just be so big that it demands an answer immediately, which is time that control opponents can't spend crafting their hands.
Also, just in general, even besides Wraths, if they're using 1-for-1 removal on your other elves and then you're able to play this, it makes the 1-for-1 removal that works on this even less so, especially if you're against the red control deck. If they end up killing one of your other elves, and then you get to play this out, and then as it turns out, now this abomination doesn't die to a lightning strike. It doesn't die to a thundering rebuke, Just the more things that they have to remove other than this, the harder it's going to become for them to deal with.
This, I think, is the best reason for elves to be green-black at the moment, just because it's the cheapest and one of the best rewards for playing elves.
Talking about cards that reward us for playing them, Bone Splitter. It's a 1-mana artifact equipment. Equipped creature gets +2/+0, and it equips for 1 mana. UFO, how would you like to split people's bones?
For a card that is so obviously battle-worn and rusty, this continues to kill people. Like, look at that art. It is, I'd say, 2 days from breaking in half. The fact that the edge has lost its entire hone, like there's nothing left of that edge. You're basically wielding it like a mallet at this point.
I mean, it's still effective, clearly.
It kind of makes sense. The card is 18 years old.
Is it?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's going to be turning 18 in October. It's going to be able to vote.
While you're bashing people's heads in with the back end of this axe, you will be killing people. This is actually a pretty efficient effect. 1 mana, 1 equip for +2/+0 can upgrade a lot of things, especially flyers, to be very real threats. Going from 1/1 to 3/1 is one of the biggest jumps I think we have in the game.
So much more powerful than Short Sword's stat line, even though it's the same numerical value. Adding 2 power is just an insane amount.
Also, there's a card that was printed not too long ago that is literally Bone Splitter, but with an equip cost of 3. Bronze Sword from Theros. 1 mana for an equipment that says equip creature gets +2/+0, but equip for 3.
Oh, we've come a long way from that.
Yeah, they've given us back the good one.
Yes, they have.
When people talk about equipment, this is the base. This is what everything else is compared to when it comes to equipment. This is one of the first pieces of equipment that really saw play.
Or was printed.
Yeah, one of the original equipment.
This is the baseline. Everything gets compared to this. Does it get to Bone Splitter? Does it do anything similar to Bone Splitter? And for decks like this will show up in aggressive decks, this will show up in tempo decks, this will show up in some mid-range decks depending on what threats they play. Just being able to spend 1 more mana to get 2 more power out of your creature can just change the course of a game.
This will kill so many people, and I am so excited to be one of those people.
And now that we're all owners of a Bone Splitter, Lightning, I feel that you might be an owner of a Cold Steel Heart, a 2-mana snow artifact that enters the battlefield tapped. And when it enters the battlefield, choose a color, and it can tap to add 1 mana of the chosen color.
So Cold Steel Heart joins a rather small group of artifacts in that it is one of 3 2-mana artifacts that also produces its own mana. We currently have Mind Stone and Guardian Idol, and while these don't see the most play, they are definitely very valuable cards in a lot of decks. And Cold Steel Heart being another cheap artifact that allows you to ramp, that allows you to make more mana off, say, a Paradox Engine, is an effect that is maybe not the most obvious, but definitely has some value here.
This is also notably the first of those 2-mana ramping artifacts that also creates colored mana, which is really important for non-Paradox decks that want to be utilizing colored mana but don't have access to like green for Paradise Druid.
Yeah, so like the Azorius control decks have been playing Mind Stone and Guardian Idol to a lesser extent just so that they can ramp up their mana because they need their Wrath earlier or they need access to double spell earlier. And Cold Steel Heart gives them a way to have more colored mana, which is what that deck is seeking after. I know I've talked to many control pilots that say that this is just getting in right where Guardian Idol was going to be in, just because this is a much more potent effect for those decks.
And if you're in the spot of, say, Paradox Engine, looking to just cast as many different ramping artifacts as you can, then this probably goes in addition to the other two that we already have.
Yeah, for sure. Some decks are going to want the density of all three just because it's 2 mana ramp, but this one is definitely a unique one. Also, being a snow permanent, it isn't going to come up too often. It also enters tapped if Redain's on the battlefield.
It already enters tapped.
Yes.
It enters double tapped.
Yes.
It's also not a snow land. That's like
I know.
Anyways.
Gets hit by Gaddock Teague.
The point being is that it adds colored mana, which is very important for some decks, which isn't going to be something that's going to be immediately obvious, especially if you compare these to Mind Stone and Guardian Idol. But even in, let's say, Mono Black, this is a card that Mono Black pilots for Mono Black control and Mono Black midrange have been looking at just because they play a lot of pip heavy spells, and this means that they're able to cast their triple black spells with just a little bit more ease, being able to be like, play this rock on 2, turn 3, play this 4 pip black spell. I look forward to doing that myself. It just has a lot of interesting utility that isn't immediately obvious, and it'll be fun to see what people do with it. Speaking of rather fun cards that some people have been looking at for some decks, let's look at Inspiring Statuary, a 3-mana artifact that says simply, non-artifact spells you cast have Improvise. Improvise is an ability that lets you tap artifacts after you have spent all the mana you plan on spending to cast the spell to pay for 1 colorless cost on the card. So, while this won't help you cast artifacts, Statuary essentially acts as a 3-mana mana rock for any non-artifact spell you cast, and allows you to use other artifacts that can't be tapped for mana for those as well. Seismic, tell me a bit about Inspiring Statuary.
So, I'm one of the naysayers on this card, but I do think that this card is really interesting and poses a dilemma that I think a surprisingly few number of decks can answer. The question brought by Inspiring Statuary is both, can you have enough non-artifact spells for you to consistently being able to use the text on the card? And also, do you have enough artifacts that you control so that you can consistently make sure that this card isn't, say, just a manalith, a 3-mana artifact that taps for mana? And I think for almost every deck, the answer to that dilemma is no. However, I do think that the question will become easier as further sets come down the line. For example, clues are a fundamental part of the Shadows over Innistrad block. And so when we get cards from that block, it could be really interesting to see what Inspiring Statuary does to those cards to make it so that you can play your non-artifact spells and also be tapping these artifacts that you have lying around to pay for those. I don't think we're there yet.
Yeah, remember that clue deck I talked about back in the start of this episode?
I do.
Inspiring Statuary was actually something I used in that deck because I used the extra clues and Inspiring Statuary to cast Eldrazi. You can possibly do that when Shadows of Innistrad comes out to do interesting things with clues, because Inspiring Statuary and clues have this really interesting pair where most of the things that make clues aren't artifacts. So they kind of ramp themselves out. Right now, that's not really the case. You're making artifacts by casting artifacts. And unfortunately, this is not a good card. It does not work in any of the decks that could possibly want it, specifically being, Paradox Engine combo decks, both versions, the artifact heavy version and the creature heavy version. And additionally, at the time of recording, Improvised is bugged with Paradox Engine, where if you have any colorless mana floating, you cannot use Improvise to pay for colorless costs. So you're not actually able to make extra mana right now. If that gets fixed, it's slightly better in Paradox decks, but right now, in addition to it already not being that impactful and also having that bug, it's just not playable.
Yeah, there is some interesting things that can be done, perhaps. I'm not entirely sure where I'm going with it yet, but talking again about those mono black control decks and some other controlling strategies like that take a lot of time. There's a lot of cards that sometimes those decks will play that effectively play like the clues would and allow you to have some more extra mana up. Again, just being able to double spell sooner allows those decks to really function.
It's just hard to look at this and not compare it unfairly with Skyclave Relic, which is a 3-mana artifact that taps for any color, has indestructible, and also a kicker that if you pay 3 more mana on top of the 3 mana you just cast, you got 2 copies, so now you have 3 extra mana instead of just 1.
It is also worth mentioning that those copies enter tapped.
Yes, and the original one does not.
Yes. Again, I don't know if it's correct in those decks, but it's definitely a unique tool for those decks, so it may see some play. Just, it's not going to be insane, and it's definitely going to be a card that later down the line, when we have more efficient stuff, it's going to not, it's not going to be around as much.
Yeah, I definitely think right now, even disregarding the current improvise bug, it's still generally going to be a worse manolith with the cards we currently have in the format.
Speaking of cards that are the worst version of their cycle, but are still interesting, for 3 mana, Sword of Body and Mind. It is an artifact equipment. Equipped creature gets +2/+2, has protection from green and from blue, and whenever equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, you create a 2/2 green wolf creature token, and that player mills 10 cards. And it equips for 2 mana. UFO. Talk to us a bit about sword. It's a sword.
Yep. So you know how we talk about Gladiator being like a sort of arena cube constructed? There's one card in cubes that is so much more powerful in that format than any 100-card singleton format, and it's Sort of Body and Mind. 40 cards versus 100 cards makes Mill a very different beast. And unfortunately, the 10-card mill goes from being an upside for the person attacking with this card to being a downside. I would have this Sort of Body and Mind rated several points higher in just every case if you may mill as opposed to must. A +2/+2 protection from green and blue makes a 2/2 green wolf every single turn when it gets in. Like, that is actually a very good rate for an equipment, and the equip cost is low enough that it will come down and be impactful pretty early in the game. But the mill can't be ignored. You're gonna be playing a Sort of Body and Mind, and you're gonna be so excited that it gives you protection from blue against your blue-white control opponent, until you realize that milling them just turned on the search first counter. That milling them just made it so their Torrential Gearhulk now has so many things to use. That milling them put Think Twice in their graveyard, so now they can actually draw a card. That milling them put Chemist's Insight in their graveyard, so now they can draw more cards. That milling them put Spider Spawning in their graveyard, because they're playing that for some reason, and it makes them a bunch of tokens. There's every single deck in this format, because of the nature of our format, is using their graveyard in some way to get some amount of value. Even the fastest aggro decks are playing some number of escape cards, some number of cards that care about using their graveyard to a extent, which means if the Sword of Body and Mind isn't absolutely hosing your opponent, the mill can lose you the game instead of winning it.
Yeah, it's definitely a bit of an awkward dance to play with this card, to say the least, because of the advantage it can give your opponent. But due to the card pool, and just what is available with those tools, I do think it still has a home in some, weirdly enough, in some green aggro decks. The point being is that if I'm to feel comfortable playing this card and to feel comfortable recommending it to someone to play this card, I feel that it's important to play some sort of cards that gain value from exiling cards from your opponent's graveyard. So cards like this might be Scavenging Ooze, which is a 2-mana 2/2 that has the text, you can pay a green to exile a card from target player's graveyard. And if it is a creature, you gain a life and it gets a +1/+1 counter. So I think it has very useful utility in decks that play cards like that and can take extra advantage of possibly giving your opponent an advantage. It is worth mentioning that because it gives your creature protection from green, this means that you can't target your own creature with green spells, which makes this a little bit awkward because sometimes you're going to want to target your creature with fight spells so that they can fight a creature that you don't control. But I still think it's worth mentioning that this card has utility in decks like that, and decks like Mono White, where you can be playing cards like Apostle of Purifying Light, which, for the purposes of our conversation, the important word is pay 2 colorless mana, exile a card from target graveyard. So, this card is very interesting. It can be very powerful, but you need to be careful with it, and you need to be already wanting to play effects that interact with your opponent's graveyard if you're going to be playing this card and having it be worth a while. So, if you're thinking about sliding this into your mono red aggressive deck for some reason, you need to be very careful playing this because this can give your opponent a way to drag that game back in, and you don't have answers for what you're going to be putting in their graveyard. So you just need to be aware of that when you're playing this deck or playing this card in that deck. So it's a cool sword. It's a sword still, so there's fun with that, but it's just a card that isn't going to be an auto include, and you need to be wary when you're putting it in your list. Speaking of another card that could possibly be an auto include and probably shouldn't be, is Blinkmoth Nexus. This one's a land that taps for a colorless and then has pay 1. Blinkmoth Nexus becomes a 1/1 Blinkmoth artifact creature with flying until end of turn, and it's still a land. And then pay 1, tap it, target Blinkmoth creature gets +1/+1 until end of turn. Lightning, tell us a bit about this land.
Yeah, so Blinkmoth Nexus is another land that can turn into a creature. We have, I believe, 3 of these already. The most recent being Faceless Haven, a snow land that taps for colorless, and you can pay 3 mana from snow sources, 3 snow mana, to make it a 4/3 with vigilance. And Blinkmoth Nexus is definitely different from the other creature lands that we have. It creates a smaller body, but also has a smaller cost associated with getting that body. And I'm not entirely sure whether it fits in the same slots as cards like Faceless Haven. I know that card has become pretty big in aggro and some mid-range because it ends up being a reasonable mana sink once you run out of other things to do, and a 4/3 is actually hits like a truck, and Blinkmoth Nexus does not really do that, but this card does allow you to add another body into combat. It blocks rather well, and I don't have any specific places where I'm looking to play Blinkmoth, but I can definitely see decks I'm playing find a spot for it.
This is definitely better for some of the more reactive aggressive decks. So decks like Tempo, or decks that might have black cards in them, like cards that are looking to play removal or looking to interact with what your opponent is doing, is going to enjoy this card more just because it's such a smaller mana investment for this card to beat in. You pay effectively 2 mana, one being the mana that you tap for this to become a creature, and another for it swinging in. And that's just enough. That's all it needs to be doing. It gets to do that, and then you get to hold up the rest of your mana to either deal with whatever threats they're playing, develop another threat. And while cards like Faceless Haven, for example, have vigilance, and that's still good and can sometimes still let you spend extra mana, this card gets to that point a lot faster. It allows you to do that much sooner, which is very important for the types of decks it'll see play in.
Like Joker said, I like it best in decks where you're more likely to have 2 mana sitting around than 5. And that is control and sort of tempo-based decks where you're going to be countering things on your opponent's turn, where you now have this sort of effectively free 2/2 blocker every turn, so long as you put the mana into it.
The fact that it can also just be a 3 mana 2/2 blocker for even flyers is really convenient.
There are better cards than this that could come and blow it out of the water, but right now it's not bad, it's just not amazing.
Yeah, this card isn't going to get into every single deck, so don't play it like that kind of card, but look at what you're doing in your strategy, look at when you're spending mana, when you're not spending mana, and see, do I have 2 mana that I wasn't going to use on this turn? And if so, would it be better for you to be able to start chipping your opponent? Or would it be better for you getting 1 additional damage in? Or let's say you have more mana laying around. Is it worth me playing this card in a deck with Bone Splitter so I can attack them with the 3/1 flyer every turn for 2 extra mana? Just, in general, just be willing to explore the idea that this card is not good in your deck, because that is okay, and be willing to try it even if you aren't sure, because it's a creature land. Creature lands inherently are very powerful. They give you tools against decks that try to deal with creatures in ways that creature lands get around. So, it's important. But we have 4 options now, so you have your pickings. So just be careful with what you choose.
Yeah, variable smorgasbord of options here.
Yeah. That's our time with this variable smorgasbord of an anthology. As we mentioned, not as powerful as some of the other anthologies we've gotten in the past, but it still has a lot of very powerful role players and gives us a lot of effects that we haven't seen in Gladiator. And talking about things that you normally don't see in Gladiator, let's go to UFO with the puzzle.
I would also say that some of the sort of disappointment potentially with some of these cards is disappointment that we see with a lot of cards in various sets on Magic Arena. And that disappointment is negated in a way by the Gladiator format because you're not just playing the best card of any given effect. You can't play all 4 of whatever card you have. So even though some of these cards may not be flashy or incredibly powerful compared to one other thing that exists on Arena, the fact that they're doing another copy of that effect or a unique copy of a different effect at a little bit lower power level than, say, Historic is willing to give out, that means that it's just still going to be played in Gladiator. We have that ability to play the cards that might not otherwise get into decks.
Yeah, for sure. There's just a lot going on. There's so much to say about every card in this set that even with what we did, we aren't covering every single thing that is worth mentioning about these cards. We aren't bringing up every single point. Yeah, this is just our 2 cents, what we thought about in the moment, and we're excited to build with these cards. We're excited to put these cards in decks. Even if we don't mention some weird thing that can be done with the card, do it. Make it happen. Show us your ridiculous collected Conjuring deck where you're copying it or whatever. Just have fun with what the anthologies allow, because the anthologies give us cards that, while intended to go into the historic format and allow for some more interesting decks there, it's even more impactful here, just because each of these cards can very much see play here just as one copy of. And yeah, there's so much that we could talk for hours about this. And I'm sure that UFO wishes to talk for hours about his puzzle.
Not ours, but this is a very exciting one. So today's puzzle is called Rule Number 7. And it's another sort of find the line, a lot of math, a lot of very interesting small interactions that I want to sort of highlight and are kind of common in Gladiator in some way or shape or form. So find the line, kill your opponent with no random effects and no draw. I wish you luck.
And now it's time for us to end this episode. I would like to thank you all for watching. Would like to thank you for sitting through and listening to us talk about these cards, and let us know in the comments below, along with telling us the puzzle solutions. Let us know how you like this set review formatting. Let us know if you want us to do more. Let us know if this is something you like to see from how we talk about cards. It's very important for us to get feedback from you guys about what you want to see in these episodes, because while we have a lot of ideas, it's definitely important for us to look to what our fan base wants. And as always, this has been Joker.
UFO.
I've been Seismic Lawns.
And this has been Lightning.
And if you made it this far in the podcast, I'd also would like to remind you that we do have a Patreon set up. And if you want to support the cast monetarily, that is where you can do so.
Patreon.com/Gladiator Podcast is where you can find that.
Link in the description for all our socials and that link.
As well as make sure to like, comment, and subscribe on YouTube if you're watching there. And if you would like to listen to us in a more podcasty form, we are now available where all great podcasts are found. Thank you all for watching.